Good morning. I want to tell you about Georgia May Turner. She lived her entire life in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. She was born there in 1890, the year after the first great Johnstown flood. She went to school there. She got married there. She had her children there. She built her entire life in Johnstown. By the mid-1970s, you might have said that Georgia's best years were behind her. But by all accounts, even at 87 years old, she was still feisty and independent. And she still held on to a faith in Jesus that had carried her through some hard times. Now, some of you probably know what happened in Johnstown in 1977. Anybody know? The flood, yeah. That was their third big flood. That July, a thunderstorm stalled over Cambria County and dumped almost 12 inches of rain over a 24-hour period. That is a lot of water. Now, the 6 dams that the Army Corps of Engineers had built in the 30s and 40s after the second big Johnstown flood in 1936, they began to fail, and by the dawn of July 20th, Johnstown was flooded with 6 feet of water. Georgia May Turner didn't want to leave her home. She sat on her front porch as the rains began to fall, just watching and waiting. Early in the evening, some friends passed by in a pickup truck and offered her a ride, but Georgia waved her hand and said, "I have faith that Jesus will save me." As the floodwaters rose, Georgia's situation got more and more dangerous. By nightfall, you could sail a small boat down the road that Georgia lived on, and that's how a few more friends passed by. They begged her to come with them, but Georgia waved her hand and said, "I have faith that Jesus will save me." Finally, the waters got too deep and Georgia was forced onto the roof of her small home. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, a search and rescue team was making a sweep of the area in a helicopter when they caught sight of Georgia sitting on her roof. They lowered a rope to her, but she pushed it away, and she said, "I have faith that Jesus will save me." As daylight tried to break through the storm clouds, Georgia May Turner was most likely swept away by the current, and her body was never recovered, partly because I just made her up. The next time Georgia opened her eyes, she would be looking into the face of her Savior Jesus. And she said to him, "Lord, why didn't you save me? I had faith in you." Jesus wiped the tears from her eyes, and he held her head in his hands, and he said, "My sweet child, your faith was great, but I sent you a truck and a boat and a helicopter." See, faith is great, but faith in action is what we're supposed to do. This morning we're going to look at the book of Hebrews, specifically chapter 11, which is often called the Hall of Faith. And faith is what we're going to talk about today. By the way, all the flood stuff I talked about was totally true. Georgia, I made up. So we have been digging into Paul's letters. I feel convicted now. We've been digging into Paul's letters and epistles over the past couple months, but this morning, for a change of pace, we're going to look at something that Paul didn't write, or at something that Paul probably didn't write. Scholars and theologians have spent centuries trying to figure out who wrote the book of Hebrews. Some people think Paul wrote it. Most people don't. Ultimately, the only scientific consensus that they could come to is, yeah, we're not sure. But God knows who wrote it. So we don't know who it was written by, but we know who it was written to. It was written to encourage Jewish believers who had come to faith in Jesus Christ. And they were being persecuted for those beliefs. Because it was written to believers who were Jewish before they were Christians, the author, whoever the author was, he leans heavily on Old Testament references, as we'll see in just a minute. So let's jump into the first 2 verses of chapter 11. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. Now, before we talk about faith, we should probably define what we're talking about. And I like how the author of Hebrews puts it, the evidence of things we cannot see. Some people think that faith is the opposite of doubt. But I don't think that's true. See, I think faith is somewhere in between doubting something and knowing something for sure. I'm going to give you an example. What's 2 plus 2? How many of you have faith that 2 plus 2 equals 4? Yeah. I don't need to. There's no room for argument. It can be proven without a doubt that 2 plus 2 equals 4. This is a photograph of the session where the scientists early determined in 1937 that 2 plus 2 does equal 4 conclusively. I mean, you can't have an argument about whether or not 2 plus 2 equals 4. So I don't need to have faith in that. I can do the math. Now, I'm going to step back from that. I have 2 hound dogs at my house. That's them. That's Daisy and Bella. Either one of these dogs, I was thinking about this. It's really weird that we keep dogs in our homes because they're like one step away from wolves, right? Either one of these dogs could easily kill me and eat me. And if they decided to team up, I wouldn't stand a chance. But I let them sleep in my bed because I have faith that they're not going to kill me in my sleep. I can't prove they won't do it. Now, in this case, my faith is strengthened by the knowledge that if anything happens to me, the belly rubs will stop. But I have faith that my dogs are not going to kill me in my sleep. And further down the spectrum is hope. Like, I can't prove that Marvel Studios is going to keep making superhero movies, but I really hope they do. Because they're awesome. So our spectrum of belief here, there's hope, faith, and fact. And faith is right there in the middle. It's not some vague, wishful notion about my favorite movies or something like that. And it's not something we can prove empirically. It's grounded in what God has revealed to us in his word. So let's pick up again at verse 4, where the author begins the Chronicle of the Faithful. And we're just going to skim this because this is a long chunk. But I would encourage you to take some time this week to read all of Hebrews chapter 11. Abel brought a more acceptable offering to God than Cain did because he had faith. Enoch was taken up into heaven by God because he had faith. Noah built a giant boat and saved his family because he had. Abraham packed up his belongings and left his homeland when God said so because he had. Sarah was able to bear a child in her old age because she had. Abraham was willing to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice to God because he had. Isaac promised blessings to Jacob and Esau because he had. Moses rejected his position as Pharaoh's grandson and instead joined in the suffering of his people in the desert because he had. The Israelites walked out of bondage and out of Egypt because they had. The Israelites crossed through the Red Sea on dry land and conquered Jericho because they had. Rahab the prostitute hid the Israelite spies and protected them because she had. Now it's important to notice something here. They all had faith. And yes, that is very important. But that faith drove them all to action. They all did something because of that faith. They didn't just sit around believing and contemplating and thinking about holy things. They got up and they did stuff. So we've burned through these verses so far, but at this point in the chapter, verse 32, even the author starts ripping through the list. Verses 32 to 40 go like this. How much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions and quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from death. But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prison. Some died by stoning, and some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. Some of them overthrew kingdoms, and some of them were tortured. Some of them shut the mouths of lions. Some of them were chained up in prison. Some of them beat back entire armies, and some of them were literally cut in half. But look at these last two verses again. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. God had something better in mind for us. And we know what that is. It's Jesus. It is eternal life with Jesus Christ. Now I want you to check out this list of names again. Abraham, Sarah, Noah, Isaac, Moses, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and on and on. These are the heroes of faith. But you know what? Not one person on this list is perfect. There are some heroes, yeah. But there are also prostitutes, adulterers, murderers, liars, idol worshippers, people who struggled with pride and foolishness, impatience, people who struggled with doubt and lust. You see, you don't have to be perfect to be used by God. David, who was called a man after God's own heart, made this list, and he was a mess. Samson made the list, and Samson broke the rules as fast as you could teach them to him. Abraham is hailed as the patriarch of the three biggest religions in the world, and he had a very casual relationship with the truth sometimes, but he made the list. Jephthah made a careless and kind of stupid oath that cost his daughter's life. He made the list. Gideon led the Israelites into idol worship. We forget about that one a lot. But he made the list. So you don't have to be perfect. So it doesn't matter this morning what you've failed at. It doesn't matter where you've messed up. God can still use you if you have faith. But you have to put that faith into action. Has anyone here ever heard of Charles Blondin? I did not make this guy up. He's totally real. He was a tightrope walker in the 1800s. And his most famous feat was crossing the Niagara Gorge on a tightrope in 1860. That's over 1,000 feet across. Crowds gathered as he crossed the gorge. He was 160 feet above the falls. He went across the gorge on stilts. He went across the gorge in a sack. He did it in a bicycle. And he did it blindfolded. Then he walked across the tightrope while pushing a wheelbarrow. It's hard to tell in this picture, but if you see this on a screen real close to you, you can see that he's way above the ground here. He never lost his footing and he never slipped. And the crowd went nuts. And after he reached the edge, Blondin yelled, "Do you believe that Blondin is the greatest tightrope walker in the world?" Because he liked to talk about himself in third person. And the crowd shouted, "We believe!" And Blondin screamed, "Do you believe?" And the crowd said, "We believe!" And after he spent a long time whipping the crowd into a frenzy like that, Blondin shouted, "Do you believe that Blondin can cross this tightrope carrying someone on my back?" And they shouted, "We believe!" And then Blondin asked for a volunteer. "Who will ride across the gorge on Blondin's shoulders?" And the crowd was silent. See, it's one thing to say you believe in Blondin, but it's something else altogether to jump on Blondin's back and ride across the gorge. Now, an interesting footnote to that story, a couple newspaper accounts say that after the silence became too awkward, there was a man who volunteered to ride across the gorge on Blondin's back. His name was Harry Colcord, and he was Blondin's manager. But where are you this morning? Are you standing and watching on the side, shouting your support for Blondin, but not acting on it? Or are you getting ready to climb onto Blondin's shoulders and getting ready for the ride? We're going to look at the first 4 verses of chapter 12, because I think there's 4 important lessons in these verses about how we put our faith into action. So here's chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. After all, you have not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses, I got back to the beginning. Hold on. All right, let's back up and take each verse on its own. That's why they started over. Because I think each verse here can teach us something about putting our faith into action. So back to verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. When I'm feeling really ambitious about my fitness, which obviously is not a season I'm in right now, sometimes I will run with weights. I'll carry like a 5-pound weight in each hand and go for a run. And at first, that's hard because you're carrying a lot of extra weight. But after a couple of days, you get used to it. And you don't even realize that you're carrying this extra burden with you all the time. So I'll do that for a couple of days, maybe for a week, until I get used to it. And then one morning, I'll lace up and I'll leave the house without the weights. And man, it feels like I'm flying. My pace gets better, my cadence gets better, and it's not just that I'm running faster, it's that I feel like I'm running faster. And I think the lesson here is to let it go. Now, what is it? Well, I think that's going to be different for each person here. But it's anything that holds you back from following God. It's anything that stands between you and the plan that God has for your life. And he has one. He has a plan for you, and he wants to use you. So maybe the it that you need to let go of is the relationship that you know you need to walk away from. Maybe it's the job that's causing you to compromise your principles. Maybe it's the secret sin that you just can't say no to. But whatever it is, let it go. Here's verse 2a. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. I'm going to give you another running metaphor, and I'm not going to feel bad about it because Paul does it all the time in his letters. There are 2 kinds of runners. There are those who have fallen hard, and there are those who have not fallen hard yet. When you run, you really need to watch where you're going. I mean, this is just common sense. Because if you don't, you're going to fall. And even after you've cast off the things that were holding you back, maybe the weights or something like that, you still have to watch where you're going. Let's read this first sentence again. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. We get rid of the stuff we don't need by keeping our eyes on Jesus. And that's the second lesson, is to focus on Jesus. See, it's so much easier to let go of the distractions and the weights that slow us down if our eyes are on what's really important. And what's really important in this life, as we put our faith into action, is Jesus. Focus on him and let everything else fade away. Focus on Jesus. Verses 2b and 3. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. So I'm just going to keep going with the running theme at this point. At every single organized race that I've run in, like the kind where you pay money and you get a shirt and stuff, there's always something special at the end of the route. And I'm not just talking about the food table, although the food table usually is pretty special because it's like all carbs. And it's not just the high fives from friends or the cheers from the crowd. It's the finish line. There we go. So a lot of runners will think about that during the race. When their legs start to ache, and their lungs start to burn, and their heart is pounding so hard they can hear it. They remember the food table, and they remember the high fives from the other runners. But most of all, they remember the finish line. Because they remember why they chose to run the race in the first place. So that's lesson number 3. Goals, not obstacles. Whatever path God has you on right now, whatever task he has laid before you, as you follow him, remember the goals and not the obstacles. See, if you're on a journey to reach your neighbors for Jesus, remember that goal and not the risk of your neighbors deciding that you're the weird religious guy on the block. If you're on a path to read the whole Bible in a year, remember that goal and not the list of things that keep you too busy to get into the Bible every day. And remember that even though the obstacles you're facing might seem huge, Jesus endured the cross. I know that whatever you're up against might seem like you'll never conquer it, but Jesus endured the cross. A friend that I used to run with, she would remind herself of that whenever the run got uncomfortable. She would tell herself, if Jesus can bear the cross, I can finish this run. And we can easily adapt that for whatever situation we're in. If Jesus can bear the cross, I can beat this sin. If Jesus bear the cross, then I can work to rebuild my marriage. So goals, not obstacles. Let's take a look at the final verse for this morning, chapter 12, verse 4. After all, you have not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin. One more running analogy and then I'll be done with that. It's weird to think that some morning I'm going to get up, I'm going to get out of bed, I'm going to lace up my Adidas. I always get Adidas on Black Friday because they're a good price. Put on my headphones, head out the door for my very last run. I think about that sometimes while I'm running. Like, what if this is my last run, like, ever? And then I tell myself, if I get up tomorrow morning and I can still breathe, I'm going to keep running. You have not yet given your lives in your struggle against sin, so you're not done. If you're drawing breath this morning, God is not done with you. If your heart is still beating, your work isn't done yet. Raise your hand if you're breathing this morning. Raise your hand if your heart is beating. You're not done. If anybody can answer no to either of those, you get a pass. God can still use you if you have faith. Now, I want to go back to a verse from chapter 11 that we kind of skipped earlier. This is chapter 11, verse 6. And it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who sincerely seek him. Do you want to please God this morning? Have faith. Do you want to please God this morning? Believe in him. Do you want to please God this morning? Seek him sincerely. Have faith and turn that faith into action. It's all right here in this verse. Have faith, believe, and seek him. Now, something that some people know about me, but not everybody, is that I am actually a certified English teacher in the state of Pennsylvania. I know, you thought I couldn't get any cooler, but here we are. The English teacher in me can't help but point out that faith is a noun. It's something we have. It's a thing. But it has to lead to something we do. We have to act. Act is a verb. So faith is important. You can't please God without it. It is impossible to please God without faith. But faith on its own is not enough. Later in the Bible, in James, in chapter 2, verses 14 through 18, James writes, "What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, "Goodbye, and have a good day. Stay warm and eat well." But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Now, some may argue. Some people have faith. Others have good deeds. But I say, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. See, James makes it even clearer for us. A life of following Jesus is not a choice between faith and action. It's a life of faith that leads to action. Like James said, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. Now, you probably aren't going to lead God's people to the promised land like Moses did. But maybe you can lead a Bible study. You probably won't build an ark to save your family from destruction like Noah did. But maybe you can help at the shelter to help some people stay warm this winter. You probably won't cross the sea on dry land like the Israelites did. But maybe you can go across town and help some people who need it. See, the actions that our faith leads to, they don't have to be big, grand gestures. And I would argue that, for the most part, the kingdom is not built on grand gestures and giant, heroic acts. It's built on the small things that we do each and every day. It's built on the little kindnesses that we show each other because we have faith and because that faith drives us to act. So this morning, as you think about ways that you can take your faith and turn it into action, I want you to remember 4 things. First, let it go. Whatever is holding you back, whatever is getting in your way, whatever is weighing you down, let it go and leave it behind. Second, focus on Jesus. These are out of order. Focus on Jesus. Get rid of those distractions and keep your eyes on the Savior, because it's all about Him in the end. Third, goals, not obstacles. Fix your mind on what needs to be accomplished, not the things that are standing in your way. Those things that you've let go of, there's no time to reminisce about them. Keep your eyes on the goal. And fourth, you're not done. If you're still breathing, God's plan for you isn't complete. If you're still here, God is not done with you. On Friday night, for a bunch of unrelated reasons, I ended up volunteering at the homeless shelter in Columbia. After I spent some time drying dishes and helping serve some food, I sat down to chat with a couple who was staying there. And they were celebrating because on the bus that day, they had struck up a conversation with somebody who said to them, "You seem cool. You seem like good people, and I want you to both come and apply to work for me." And that was awesome. And that was definitely a reason for them to celebrate, because a job means maybe getting their own place, and they can get out of the shelter. And I've prayed for them that they'll follow up with this woman that they met on the bus, because if they don't follow up, there isn't going to be a job for either of them. See, believing that there's a job waiting for you, that's faith. Showing up to work is action. Without showing up to work, knowing that there's a job is pretty useless. It might make you happy, at least for a while, but you're not going to get paid. So if you can't remember those 4 things, I'm going to bring it down to 1. Remember when we defined faith at the start of the message? We're going to change that definition. Faith means saying, "Yes, I will," to Jesus. So say yes to Jesus this morning. Will you pray with me?